So this morning we are once again back in Acts, and today we are going to see that Peter has spread his wings a bit and has started to travel. Previously, Peter was a bit of a homebody in Galilee where he lived. He worked there and he spent time with Jesus there. And our story today sees him travel to a place called Joppa on the coast, now called Jaffa, where he raises a woman named Tabitha. So let's hear the story now.
In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was at Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, "Please, come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room. Then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon.
So in Joppa we meet a remarkable woman named Tabitha, or Dorcas in Greek. And it's interesting that Luke gives us her name also in Greek. She probably was still alive when Luke was writing. And so it's thought he would have wanted people to recognise her. She must have been quite the celebrity if she had been raised from the dead. And we are told she was always doing good and helping the poor. Not sometimes or when she felt like it, always. She was not someone who was defined by wealth or status or power, but by her kindness. She sewed garments for widows. And widows were particularly vulnerable in those times. A wife was dependent on her husband, and when he died, she would either have to go back to her father's household or a son if she had one. Otherwise, they were totally without resources. Tabitha noticed this overlooked group. They wouldn't have been able to afford clothing, so she quietly, faithfully served them. It wasn't a few kind words, it was practical kindness. Personal, costly. And I think it can encourage us not to underestimate kind, practical actions. When she died, the widows surrounded her and they wept. And many funerals had to hire professional mourners or wailers, but not here. Their grief was genuine and heartfelt. And the widows clutched the garments in grief. The kindness lived on. And it makes us ask ourselves, where could we show some practical kindness in our lives. We might think that we aren't great with words or even prayer, but this passage shows us the power in a kind, practical act. And when Tabitha died, the community around her all grieved. And we can be confident that she was dead, as we are told she was washed and ready for burial. Yet they still sent for Peter. There was faith on their part that even though she was dead, they were aware of some resurrection power. It makes sense that they must have had some awareness that Jesus had raised people from the dead, and indeed of Jesus' own resurrection. So Peter arrives and he asks everyone to leave the room. And the first thing that he does is to kneel and pray. It wasn't rushed. He let God dictate the pace and urgency. We don't know how long he was knelt in prayer. But we know he turns to the body and says, "Tabitha, get up." And she opens her eyes and sits up. And this moment echoes an earlier miracle performed by Jesus in Mark 5, when he raised Jairus' daughter. And here are some verses from that story. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were there with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. Jesus on that occasion also told people to leave the room. And he took the little girl by the hand and said, "Talitha cum," little girl, get up. In the same way, Peter took Tabitha's hand and helped her up, showing the physical touch here is just as important as words. The words "get up" used here are the same words used both in Jairus' daughter and Tabitha, are the same words used in the passage about Jesus' resurrection. Both Jairus' daughter and Tabitha have the same resurrection power as Jesus. We too have the same resurrection power of Jesus. How incredible is that? Peter had been one of 3 disciples in that room with Jairus' daughter. He is not acting randomly. He's following a pattern he learned from Jesus. Maybe Peter was reminded of this when he knelt and prayed. Imitating Jesus' actions may have given him confidence. He had watched Jesus bring life where there was death. And now, filled with the Spirit, Peter does what his master did. God doesn't just call us to admire Jesus. He calls us to follow him, to be like him, to embody his love and his work in the world. And I wondered this week how we could copy Jesus. How will we behave? How will we speak to people? What practical acts do we do to show love? And it makes me think about who is watching us, who we are influencing, maybe without realising. Jesus influenced Peter. We're learning from Peter today. And others will learn and copy us, and so on. Jesus' love and ways are paid forward. But in order to do this well, we have to know what we are copying, who we are replicating. It's important that we spend time reflecting on Jesus, reading the Bible, praying, spending time with him, reflecting on our own lives and how we can be more Jesus-like. The story today shows kindness and power together. Tabitha's story is about kindness. Peter's is about power. The story contains such dramatic moments, but also daily acts of compassion. And this passage leaves us with two invitations. To live like Tabitha, to let our faith show up in practical ways, be known for our goodness, love people in tangible, sacrificial acts. And secondly, to follow like Peter, to learn from Jesus, watch how he loves, serves, and step out in faith to do the same. And I think for this week, that's quite enough to be getting on with. At the end of this story, many people believed in the Lord. I wonder why. And I think it's because they saw something real. They saw a woman who overflowed with kindness, a disciple who trusted God enough to act. And through it all, they saw the love, power, and compassion of Jesus. Amen.